The house was silent, but I could feel it. Not the usual quiet of empty rooms or a sleeping spouse, but something sharper, like the air itself was holding its breath. I had walked in 20 minutes early, expecting the rehearsal dinner to be ordinary, maybe tense in that understated way families always are before a wedding. Instead, I found them leaning together across the table, whispering in a language I didn't understand, eyes flashing laughter at something I wasn't part of. My hand lingered on the doorframe, unnoticed. For a moment, I felt invisible and small. They didn't see me, and I realized then that the version of trust I had built over years might already be a lie. I woke before the house stirred, as I always did. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of floorboards settling, these were the sounds I knew best. In the kitchen, I made coffee the same way I had for years, measuring beans to a precise scoop, listening to the drip like a metronome, a rhythm that anchored the morning. My husband's side of the bed was empty. He left before me most days, an early commute, an early life apart from mine. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. It was where I noticed things, small details others overlooked. Breakfast was routine. Toast, butter spread evenly, a cup of coffee set to cool while I read the headlines on my tablet. I moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to disturb the house that had been ours for a decade. I liked patterns. I liked predictability. It gave life a sense of order, a sense of control, and I trusted it. I trusted that my husband would return, that our weeknight dinners would still be ours, that the commitments we made were not just words. I remember that day clearly. The light slanting through the blinds caught the dust in the air, almost tangible in the golden glow. I moved to the living room, straightened the cushions, aligned the books on the shelf by height, by the subtle weight of familiarity. Each motion was quiet but precise. The kind of care that goes unnoticed is the kind I gave. He came home later than usual, his coat smelling faintly of the city, the coffee he carried for me slightly too hot, wrapped in the newspaper bag he always used. He smiled at me, a small, private gesture that felt like a promise. I returned it, because I had learned early on that some gestures were safer returned than dissected. I didn't question the long hours, the missed texts, the fleeting absences. Trust, after all, had been the quiet foundation of our lives together. I believed in it like I believed in the soft hum of the refrigerator. That evening, I prepared for what I thought would be a normal rehearsal dinner. I didn't imagine betrayal, not even in the corners of my mind. I dressed carefully, in muted colors, understated but deliberate, a reflection of the life I carried quietly. He kissed me before we left, brief, measured, but enough. I told myself that he had no reason to lie, no reason to shift the world beneath my feet. The drive to his mother's house was calm. I noticed the little things, streetlights flickering, the worn paint on familiar houses, the way the sky tilted to gray, but I was careful not to speak them aloud. I had always observed more than I shared. In the past, that discretion had been rewarded. I had learned that quiet vigilance often prevents conflict, that noticing without acting could preserve peace. That belief was comforting, like a soft coat in the winter of the world. At dinner, the table was set beautifully, his mother meticulous as always. I smiled, offering small pleasantries, noting who arrived on time, who lingered too long in conversation. My husband was beside me, attentive, polite, holding my hand under the table for a fleeting second. That small pressure of his fingers on mine anchored me. I felt safe. I felt seen in a world where so much was unnoticed. I thought I could trust this, our families, the rituals, the unspoken agreements that bound us together. No one noticed my quiet observation, and I didn't mind. It was my role to see what others overlooked, to notice without interfering. I trusted that life, as it had always been, would continue its steady rhythm. I didn't yet realize that trust, the same way the floorboards creaked under weight without complaint, could be fractured in silence, in laughter shared behind closed eyes, in whispers I was not yet meant to hear. That night, I left the house certain of one thing, that I had built my life on careful observation, on trust earned through years of consistency. I didn't yet know that the very foundation I relied on could hide cracks, that the people I loved might carry secrets like shadowed corners, invisible until the light shifted. I went to bed with the same quiet care I approached every day, smoothing the sheets, aligning the pillows, listening to the house breathe around me. I trusted it then, more than anything else. I didn't know how soon that trust would be tested. The unease started in small fragments, almost imperceptible, like a shadow flickering at the edge of a room. I noticed them first at breakfast, the way he hesitated before answering a text, his eyes flicking away from mine, just long enough to feel deliberate. I didn't speak. I had learned that confrontation too early can disrupt clarity, that doubt grows faster when given words. Instead, I cataloged it silently, letting the sensation settle in my chest like a slow pulse. That day at work, I kept replaying it in my mind, overanalyzing gestures that could have been meaningless. He had smiled, casual and warm, when I mentioned an errand I would run that afternoon. But then his hand lingered on the car door, almost brushing mine. Too light to notice at first, too precise to ignore once I did. It made no sense, and I dismissed it. Perhaps it was a leftover habit, a ghost of some thought I couldn't reach. I told myself that unease didn't mean truth. Later at home, the house felt different. I moved through familiar rooms with the same careful routine, but each sound seemed sharper. A cabinet closed a fraction too loudly. The floor creaked where it had never creaked before. My hands, idle for a moment, noticed the misaligned picture frame, the dust on the shelf I swore I had cleaned that morning. I adjusted each thing, silently, methodically, as if aligning the house would also align the uncertain tension inside me. Dinner arrived with polite conversation, yet the tone was slightly off. His mother commented on trivial matters with an unusual edge, words sharpened by hidden amusement. I smiled, nodded, and let it pass. I trusted appearances, but the first hints of discomfort were forming, lodged deep in the base of my awareness. My husband laughed at her jokes, but the sound felt different, a little too quick, a little too hollow. I caught it but said nothing. My voice had never been necessary to observe. The next morning, I noticed another discrepancy. His phone lay face down on the counter, which was normal except the screen glowed briefly, a notification he didn't acknowledge. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. It was enough to mark the pattern in my mind, small, irregular, unexplained. I kept my routine, letting the house absorb my silence, letting the rhythm of coffee, toast, newspaper, and window light continue as if nothing had changed. My mind cataloged everything. My heart held only questions. Evenings became a trial of subtle signals. A text left unanswered, a message deleted before I could see it. He lingered longer in conversations with his mother, just enough that I felt the quiet shift, the tug of exclusion. I caught glimpses of notes on the counter, faint, half-glimpsed words that made no sense, but I dismissed them as mistakes, harmless errors in routine. It was easier that way. Denial was a tool I used carefully, a shield I had always trusted to preserve equilibrium. I noticed the quiet avoidance most sharply when he spoke about the wedding plans. He paused at details I had long managed, shifting responsibilities subtly. His words were gentle, casual, yet the undercurrent felt deliberate. I stayed silent, as always, because silence allowed me to see more, to understand without distortion. I cataloged the patterns, collected the half-glances, the slight gestures, the small inconsistencies. Every detail was a thread, but I didn't yet know what they would weave into. Sleep brought no relief. I lay awake, listening to the familiar hum of the city outside our window, feeling a subtle dissonance in the apartment's quiet. Shadows moved where none should, the corners too dark, the walls too still. The morning light revealed nothing unusual, yet the gut tension persisted. I noticed it in myself, the way I tightened my jaw, the slight ache in my chest that I had learned to ignore. Trust, I reminded myself, was built over years. But that trust was starting to feel fragile, as though it could fracture under the smallest weight. And yet nothing had changed overtly. He smiled, kissed me, held my hand, continued routines unchanged. I reassured myself in the quiet spaces, in the small rituals that had always grounded me. Unease could be fleeting, meaningless. But the seed had been planted, subtle as it was, and it would not leave. I went to bed that night with a careful steadiness, yet the unease lingered in my bones. It was a quiet shadow, barely visible, but I could feel it stretching across our lives, waiting to be seen. It was the first time I couldn't ignore it. The unease had grown over days, small dissonances coalescing into a shape I didn't yet fully recognize. At dinner that night, I noticed it most clearly. The way he leaned toward her, not just casually, but deliberately, as though he were part of a secret language I was excluded from. His laughter, once familiar, now carried a texture I could not place. Sharp, practiced, knowing. I stayed still, observing, noting, but I did not speak. Speaking felt premature. Observation always revealed more than accusation. The first red flag was subtle, almost invisible. His hand brushed hers across the table, deliberate in timing, yet casual in appearance. I counted the seconds, measured the distance, catalogued the rhythm. I had learned to watch for these things. It was what kept me grounded in a life where appearances could be deceiving. Something had shifted. It was in the way the shadows played on their faces, the way words lingered unspoken between them. Later, in the car on the way home, I noticed the pattern extending beyond the obvious. His phone chimed while he drove, a message he didn't acknowledge. His thumb hovered over it briefly, then he slid it into his pocket as though nothing had happened. I wanted to ask, to confront, but I knew better. Observation first. Confirmation later. His behavior was too precise to be accidental, yet too careful to confirm. My mind cataloged every detail like a ledger, each entry a quiet warning. At home, I checked the small routines for evidence of disruption. Notes left behind, misplaced receipts, strange messages half erased on his computer. Nothing definitive, nothing overt, but enough to make me pause. I felt the tension coil in my chest, a low, persistent pressure. I reminded myself to remain calm. Restraint had always been my ally. Acting on suspicion without certainty could fracture reality beyond repair. I cataloged the discrepancies and tucked them away, building a mental map of patterns and anomalies. Even mundane gestures began to take on weight. He kissed me that night, but it lacked the quiet intimacy I had relied on for years. The pressure of his lips was measured, almost rehearsed. I noticed the slight hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't recognition or warmth. I held his gaze briefly, then looked away, letting the silence stretch. Silence allowed me to see more. In the quiet, inconsistencies sharpened like the edge of a knife. The next morning, I discovered another small irregularity. A receipt tucked into a drawer where it shouldn't have been. A restaurant I didn't recognize, dated the previous week. I didn't confront him immediately. I cataloged it, storing it in the ledger of moments I could not yet fully explain. My mind, trained to notice the unnoticed, began assembling a pattern. Small, precise deviations from the life I had trusted. Work provided temporary refuge, but even there I noticed the tension clinging to me. My thoughts returned repeatedly to the dinner table, to the glances, to the gestures that felt deliberately hidden yet revealed. I made a mental note of each inconsistency, each fraction of motion that defied explanation. Patterns were emerging. Confirmation, I realized, was closer than I had anticipated. By evening, the red flags were unmistakable. He spoke of errands and meetings that overlapped with times I knew he was elsewhere. His explanations were careful, rehearsed. I listened, silently, cataloging the words against the facts I had observed. There was no anger, no confrontation, just quiet, deliberate attention. I reminded myself that patience had always yielded clarity. Hasty action led only to disruption. Observation allowed me to understand truth before it revealed itself. And yet, beneath restraint, a subtle fear took root. The trust I had relied on, the foundation of years, felt suddenly fragile. Every glance, every hesitation, every almost invisible gesture was a thread in a web I did not yet fully see. But I felt its edges pressing against my chest, tightening with each careful observation. The world I had known, predictable, secure, ordered, was beginning to tilt in small, deliberate increments. I went to bed that night counting details, not sheep. Each anomaly, each red flag, was a note in a quiet symphony of unease. I didn't speak. I didn't accuse. I merely cataloged, observed, and waited. The patterns were forming. The truth was coming into focus. And I knew that once the next thread revealed itself, there would be no turning back. By this point, the tension was no longer a subtle shadow. It had begun to press against me in ways I could no longer ignore. The signs were too deliberate, too patterned, yet every time I tried to mention them, the words seemed to dissolve before reaching my lips. When I did speak, my concerns were met with swift dismissal. It began one evening at home. I had noticed a discrepancy in his calendar, an appointment that didn't align with anything he had told me. I asked, calmly, about the timing, keeping my tone measured. "You must be mistaken," he said, almost too smoothly. His smile was faint, reassuring, yet it carried the weight of control. "I already told you it's nothing, you're imagining things." The words should have unsettled me, but I had learned to let them slide. The first hint of gaslighting was subtle, the quiet suggestion that I had misread reality, that my observations were flawed. But over the following days, the dismissals multiplied. Small incidents, text messages deleted too quickly, receipts tucked away, forgotten errands, were met with the same calm denial. "You're overthinking again," he said once, lightly, as though my perception were a habitual flaw, not a reaction to real evidence. I began to notice the pattern extend beyond him. Conversations with family or friends about mundane topics were occasionally punctuated with laughter or glances exchanged behind my back. Not overt, not cruel, but precise. It was a language of exclusion I could sense without hearing. When I mentioned the smallest of my observations, the reactions were swift and smooth. Reassurance, gentle mockery, the quiet suggestion that I had imagined it. One night I confronted him about something tangible, a text he had ignored that I had seen on his phone, a message from someone I didn't know. His response was practiced, calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, voice steady. "You're remembering wrong. I didn't even read that." The calmness was infuriating, the precision of denial deliberate. I felt the first real sting of isolation. The truth was there, yet I was made to question my own memory, my own senses. The gaslighting extended into the routines I relied upon for stability. Notes left on the counter vanished. Messages I thought I had sent never appeared in his replies. Even small confirmations, like double-checking plans or reviewing receipts, became exercises in futility. Each attempt to validate my perception was met with gentle but firm negation. I began to recognize the pattern. He was shaping reality, subtly, carefully, without ever raising his voice or showing anger. The power imbalance was quiet but undeniable. I found myself retreating inward, maintaining my routines with even greater precision. The rituals that once felt comforting now became my armor. Coffee in the morning, books arranged just so, floors swept and dusted with exacting care. I clung to these patterns as one clings to a rope over an abyss. The world outside the home felt uncertain, but within the walls I had control, even if only of small, insignificant details. Yet the emotional cost was accumulating. I felt the tension settle into my chest, a quiet ache I could not articulate. Sleep was restless. Mornings came with a heaviness I could not shake. I reminded myself to observe, to catalog, to wait. Reacting without clarity would only strengthen their control, and I had learned that restraint preserved perspective, even as it deepened isolation. I noticed it in subtle glances at family gatherings, the way he would position himself near her, the faint tilt of his head as if signaling a private joke, the way laughter lingered where I could not reach it. I mentioned nothing. Any attempt to confront or clarify was met with calm, rational dismissal. I was forced to trust my own perception while simultaneously being told it was flawed. It was exhausting, a slow erosion of certainty that left a hollow ache behind the chest bone. I began cataloging everything meticulously. Every text, every gesture, every inconsistency was recorded in my mind, indexed for future reference. I didn't know when or if I would confront it, but I recognized that power was being exercised quietly, through words, through subtle exclusion, through precise denial. My silence became a strategy, an act of observation and self-preservation. The first real moment of clarity came late one night. He had gone to bed, leaving the house quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat in the dim light, cataloging each irregularity, each moment where reality had been bent around my perception. The realization settled in fully. I was not imagining things. I was not flawed. The betrayal existed, but it was wrapped in calmness, in denial, in the quiet precision of someone who knew exactly how to maintain control. The cost of observation was heavy. The emotional weight pressed down, but it also sharpened my awareness. I had seen the first hints of the truth. The gaslighting and dismissal had not erased reality. They had only hidden it behind a veil of calm, subtle authority. And I understood, finally, that patience and quiet observation would be the only weapons I had. The truth began to leak in fragments, subtle and unrelenting. It wasn't a revelation shouted in anger or drama. It was a quiet accumulation of evidence, the kind that settled slowly and left no room for doubt. I noticed the first real breach one evening while going through emails on our shared account. A thread appeared, innocuous at first glance, a simple exchange that seemed work-related. But the tone, the choice of words, the timing, it didn't belong. I recognized patterns I had cataloged in silence, now mirrored in communication I could not ignore. At dinner that night, I observed more. His mother's glance lingered too long when he mentioned a mundane errand. A smile passed between them, just brief enough to seem accidental, but precise enough that I felt it in my chest. It was a reminder that the truth was not hidden in chaos, but in the deliberate subtleties I had been tracking for weeks. I noted it quietly, as always. I did not speak. I did not act. Observation was the conduit to clarity. Then came the receipts. I found them tucked away in drawers, in envelopes not meant for me, organized carefully but in places I would inevitably discover. Each one told a story of movements, meals, and moments that contradicted the explanations I had been given. I laid them out one evening on the dining table, measuring time, place, and interaction. The evidence was scattered yet coherent, forming a mosaic of intentional omission. It was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just the quiet, devastating clarity of reality asserting itself. A friend of his, someone I trusted to be neutral, offered more confirmation without even knowing it. A casual remark about lunch plans that overlapped with something my husband had described as solitary. The words were fleeting, almost accidental, but precise. I filed them away with the receipts and the emails, the catalog growing heavier, more impossible to dismiss. Witnesses existed even where I could not directly confront them. They were signs in plain sight, waiting for me to notice. The house itself became a record of subtle betrayals. Small misalignments in routine, items left where they shouldn't have been, notes misfiled, all signs that the narrative I had believed in was fractured. The power of this realization was quiet but absolute. It did not explode into confrontation. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, accumulating, waiting for the moment it could no longer be denied. I felt the emotional cost in the quiet hours before dawn. Sleep had become shallow, punctuated by the echo of small gestures and hidden movements. I walked through the apartment as if it were a crime scene, cataloging every shadow, every misplaced object. The betrayal was no longer invisible. It had substance, and it was precise. My restraint allowed me to see more, to understand more, to map the truth in meticulous detail. A file on his computer caught my attention next. At first, it appeared innocuous, a folder titled for work. But the timestamps, the correspondence within, the subtle deletion of prior entries, it all aligned with what I had already noticed. The evidence was not reckless or careless. It was methodical, intentional, almost elegant in its precision. Each small breach reinforced the same conclusion. I was not imagining things. The betrayal was real, and it had been orchestrated with care. Even casual interactions began to reveal cracks. His tone shifted slightly when certain names were mentioned. Laughter fell differently in rooms where I once felt secure. I noticed these inconsistencies in the same way I had noticed the tilt of picture frames, the lingering gestures, the hidden receipts. Everything, no matter how mundane, now carried weight. Observation had become a tool of clarity, but it was also a burden I could not lay down. By the end of the week, I had assembled a quiet dossier of proof, receipts, emails, witness remarks, and minor inconsistencies that formed a coherent picture. I did not need confrontation to validate it. Reality had begun asserting itself in ways that no dismissal or gaslighting could erase. The power dynamic was clear. They controlled narrative only in the absence of scrutiny. Once I had cataloged it, once I had seen the evidence for what it was, their control was diminished, even if only silently. I lay in bed that night with a precise awareness of everything I had gathered. Each item, each gesture, each shadow of truth formed a lattice in my mind. The quiet exposure was more devastating than any argument could have been. It did not offer resolution. It did not promise confrontation. But it did confirm what I had feared. The trust I had relied on had been fractured, and I now had the clarity to see exactly how deep the fracture ran. For the first time, I allowed myself a measure of certainty. The betrayal was real. The gaslighting was calculated, and the quiet accumulation of evidence had begun to shift the balance, not through anger or confrontation, but through the undeniable weight of observation. The fractures I had quietly catalogued now began to widen, and the stakes rose in ways I could feel without anyone speaking them aloud. The subtle patterns of betrayal no longer existed only in shadows. They had begun to press into daylight, forcing action, forcing presence, forcing awareness. I had amassed months of evidence, observations, receipts, and witness remarks, but nothing had yet been confronted. The tension between what I knew and what was acknowledged created a pressure I could no longer ignore, though I still held myself back, restrained by the knowledge that patience gave clarity. It began with small confrontations disguised as casual conversation. I asked him about details he had previously dismissed, phrasing questions in the calmest tones I could muster. "I thought you said, or didn't this happen differently?" Each time, he answered with practiced ease, almost too smooth, his voice careful, controlled. But there was a crack in the armor this time, a subtle hesitation, a shadow of discomfort that betrayed the calm surface. I noted it silently, feeling the first real shift in power, not through confrontation, but through observation of his response under pressure. The escalation became clearer when I discovered new evidence, texts, receipts, and emails that had been deliberately hidden. They aligned with the inconsistencies I had been tracking for weeks, but now the volume of proof made the pattern undeniable. I laid them out on the kitchen counter, methodically, as though cataloging them would somehow make the truth more tangible. I didn't speak of them. I didn't accuse. The act of placing them in front of me, organizing them, letting them exist in plain sight, was a quiet assertion of control. He noticed, of course, though he did not comment. That evening, there was a subtle change in the way he moved, a careful recalibration in every gesture. The conversation was lighter, almost rehearsed, as though each word and pause had been calculated. I realized he was aware I had seen more than I had spoken, that my silence carried weight. The power dynamic was shifting, but not through confrontation, through evidence, through subtle acknowledgement, through the quiet insistence of observation. I also began to see it in his mother. The glances, the subtle alignment of their gestures, the faint laughter that had once been hidden, it became more calculated, more cautious, more aware of my presence. I had entered a space where the truth existed both in what was done and in what was left unsaid. Each subtle adjustment was a reaction to my awareness, a testament to the fact that the exposure of partial truth had already begun to change behavior. At home, I noticed the tension in the smallest details. Doors closed more deliberately, footsteps lighter, conversations paused when I entered the room. Each movement was measured, as though the household itself had become a stage, and we were all playing roles under a script I was now reading fluently. The quiet, calculated responses felt like a dance, and I observed every step. My restraint was no longer passive. It was active, a form of power in itself, waiting for the right moment to reveal full clarity. One evening, I found a new email on his work account, addressed in ways that suggested secrecy. I opened it only to confirm my suspicions. The correspondence was deliberate, the tone intimate, the patterns unmistakable. I didn't confront him. I didn't react. I simply noted the timestamp, the words, the implications. The evidence accumulated into a framework that I could not ignore, a lattice of betrayal that now demanded acknowledgement. He began testing boundaries subtly. A lingering glance, a faint brush of the hand, questions about where I had been, all calibrated to gauge my awareness. I responded with measured restraint, acknowledging nothing, observing everything. Each test, each subtle probe, became another confirmation of the power that was shifting, not through his actions, but through my understanding, my quiet vigilance, my refusal to be deceived. By the end of the week, the pressure was tangible. Conversations were layered with double meanings, laughter contained warnings, and every glance carried weight. I had positioned myself silently, letting the truth accumulate around me while maintaining calm. The betrayal had escalated in scope, but so had my observation, my understanding, my control over what I chose to see and how I interpreted it. In the quiet moments alone, I felt the emotional weight settle into my chest. The realization was complete. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Exposure of truth could not be forced. It had to emerge naturally, through careful observation and patience. But even without confrontation, consequences were beginning to ripple. I could sense it in the subtle recalibration of their movements, in the calculated avoidance of mistakes, in the quiet acknowledgement that the game was no longer entirely theirs. That night, I sat with the evidence spread across the table, the receipts, emails, and notes forming a map of betrayal. I didn't need to speak. The escalation had reached a point where reality had begun to assert itself quietly, inexorably. Power, I realized, did not require confrontation. It existed in systems, in observation, in the weight of truth held silently. The next steps would require patience, but the shift had already begun. I was no longer invisible. I was present, aware, and the truth was beginning to press against the walls of denial. The truth settled around me like a weight I could neither shift nor ignore. By now, the evidence was undeniable. Receipts, emails, messages, subtle glances, and overlapping timelines, all forming a lattice of calculated betrayal. The realization was sharp, precise, and relentless. I felt it not as anger, but as a quiet pressure in my chest, a deep ache that whispered of betrayal, power imbalance, and the cost of patience. It came to me one evening as I sat alone in the dim light of our living room. The house was still, the usual hum of the city outside muted by the walls around me. I ran my hands along the surfaces, touching objects as if to reassure myself that at least the tangible world remained in order. But the weight of human deception was invisible, pressing on every corner, every shadow. I realized then that restraint had a cost. The longer I waited, the heavier the burden became. I thought about confrontation, as I had done in fleeting moments of frustration over the past weeks. The words formed in my mind, calm, deliberate, cutting, but I stopped myself. Speaking would not give me clarity, would not reveal truth. It would only escalate, provoke, and allow them to regain control through argument, through narrative. I understood that the moral breaking point was not about unleashing anger. It was about accepting reality without surrendering to it. The emotional cost was tangible. Sleep had become shallow, and even waking hours carried a subtle tension. Every glance between them, every deliberate omission, every soft laugh that I was excluded from, it all pressed against me. I felt it in my jaw, in the subtle tightening of my chest, in the quiet awareness of every detail. I catalogued it silently, not to expose, not to accuse, but to understand. Observation had become my tool, my defense, my anchor. I thought about power, the invisible kind, the one not demonstrated in force but in systems and control. They had wielded it carefully, shaping perception, bending reality through gentle denial, subtle gestures, and orchestrated omission. Now I held a different kind of power, clarity. It did not require confrontation. It did not need witnesses or proof beyond my own observation. I could see the structure of the betrayal in its entirety, and that understanding shifted the balance quietly but irrevocably. Even in this moment, I felt the temptation to act. A small, fleeting desire for confrontation, for acknowledgement, surged through me, but I recognized it instantly as noise, as instinct rather than strategy. Acting impulsively would diminish the control I had built through patience, through meticulous observation, through silence. Restraint was my weapon, my shield, and my acknowledgement of the cost. The breaking point was not about reaction, it was about internal reckoning. I reflected on trust, the foundation of my life now fractured. The betrayal was personal, intimate, and insidious, but it was also illuminating. I understood patterns, motives, and the lengths to which someone could manipulate perception. I understood that the absence of recognition does not negate truth, that silence does not equal ignorance. I recognized the subtle consequence of their actions. Power over perception only works when the observer is unaware. I was now fully aware. The moral breaking point brought another realization: acceptance. Not of forgiveness, not of reconciliation, but of understanding the landscape of betrayal and the emotional cost it demanded. I accepted the weight of knowing, of seeing the patterns, of cataloging the truth in silence. It was a private reckoning, one that did not require validation from others. My understanding itself became the boundary of control I had regained. In the quiet, I allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of emotion: grief for the trust lost, sorrow for the distance created, disappointment in human subtlety. But I did not allow it to dictate action. Tears came and went in silence, unnoticed, unacknowledged. I sat with the ache in my chest and allowed the quiet presence of truth to settle over me. By the end of that night, I had made a decision. I would not confront. I would not accuse. I would observe. I would maintain restraint. The burden of awareness was heavy, but it was also precise. I had reached the point where emotion was no longer reactionary. It was recognition, a clear acknowledgement of betrayal and its cost. I understood that the most devastating power I could wield was patience, clarity, and restraint. And so I carried it forward, the weight of truth pressing against my chest, the clarity in my mind, the quiet understanding of consequences forming silently around me. The moral and emotional breaking point had been reached, not in words or action, but in recognition, in internal reckoning, in the calm, devastating knowledge of what had been done and the cost it demanded. The truth no longer needed to be whispered or inferred. It began asserting itself quietly, in ways that could not be denied. The patterns I had cataloged, the observations I had maintained in silence, now unfolded into consequences that were subtle, precise, and undeniable. I did not speak. I did not demand acknowledgement. Reality, it seemed, had a way of correcting itself, and I watched it unfold like a slow tide against the carefully constructed facade of their deception. It began with small slips. He misremembered details I had documented meticulously. Names, dates, times, the very receipts and emails I had collected. At first, I noted them silently, allowing the inconsistencies to stack. Each mistake, each lapse, was a quiet ripple that undermined the control he had exerted for months. It was not punishment. It was the natural consequence of a life built on careful concealment now colliding with precise observation. I noticed changes in their behavior, subtle but unmistakable. The glances shared between them grew guarded, laughter more cautious, movements measured. There was an awareness now, though unspoken, that the patterns I had observed were no longer invisible. Their carefully constructed reality, once impermeable, began to feel fragile. I did not intervene. I did not expose. I simply cataloged the shift. Silence had become a quiet force, one that reshaped dynamics without confrontation. A friend, one who had remained neutral in our interactions, offered confirmation without realizing it. Casual remarks about dinner, meetings, and errands aligned with my observations. Each accidental acknowledgement reinforced the web I had quietly traced. There was no need to argue, no need for proof beyond observation. Reality itself began bending, subtly, around the truths I had identified. The system of concealment was cracking, not from revelation, but from its own inconsistency. At home, I began noticing the more tangible effects. Receipts once hidden were misfiled or left in plain sight. Emails sent with deliberate care were suddenly misaddressed. Notes that had been carefully deleted appeared in draft folders. I cataloged each slip silently, each mistake a small victory in a battle I did not wage out loud. The consequences of their deception were unfolding naturally, as if the weight of truth could not be suppressed indefinitely. The emotional impact was undeniable. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in revenge, not in celebration, but in the recognition that deception has a cost, and that cost is often borne in the details. Observing without intervention had allowed me to see the inevitability of consequences, and the knowledge was heavy, precise, and unyielding. My restraint had shifted power, not through confrontation, but through the quiet assertion of clarity and awareness. One evening, I caught a glance he did not intend for me to see, a fleeting moment of realization in his eyes, a micro-expression of acknowledgement that the careful control he had wielded was slipping. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. I noted it quietly, storing it with the receipts, emails, and witness remarks that formed the mosaic of truth. The consequence of exposure, of inevitable clarity, had begun manifesting not as spectacle, but as presence. Even his mother showed signs of recalibration. Her laughter was lighter, less confident, gestures less assured. I observed the subtle loss of dominance, the quiet adjustment to a dynamic that was no longer entirely under her control. The power she had exercised so delicately had met the quiet force of clarity, and it shifted. Not dramatically, not publicly, but perceptibly. The house, once a stage for concealed conversations, now carried the weight of truth in its spaces. Objects were misaligned, gestures carefully measured, silences heavier than before. I did not manipulate or provoke, I observed. The natural unfolding of consequences was a testament to the subtle power of awareness and restraint. The system of deception could not endure against a witness who saw everything without interference. By the end of the week, the quiet consequences were unmistakable. Control had shifted, subtly but irrevocably, and the truth asserted itself without declaration. I remained calm, restrained, and methodical. Observation had yielded clarity, clarity had yielded consequence, and consequence had altered the dynamics entirely, without spectacle, without confrontation, without drama. The lesson, quiet and devastating, was clear. Betrayal carries a cost, and the cost is often paid in the details, in mistakes, and in the slow accumulation of truth. I remained a silent witness, bearing the weight of what had been done, watching consequences unfold without interference. The power of truth was quiet but absolute. The aftermath was subtle. No declarations, no confrontations, no dramatic collapse. The house carried the same familiar hum, but everything felt heavier, more measured. Their laughter was quieter, more cautious, as if even the air had learned to respect the presence of truth. I moved through the rooms as I always had, cataloging the small shifts, noting what had changed without needing to speak. He no longer leaned too close, no longer whispered in ways meant to exclude me. His glances carried hesitation instead of certainty. The receipts, Emails and small traces of deception had left marks that could not be erased. I did not gloat. I did not demand apology. The balance had shifted quietly, inexorably, through the weight of observation and restraint. Power, I realized, was not in loud action. It had always been in the ability to see clearly and to let truth unfold on its own. Even their subtle attempts to reclaim control were measured, tentative. Every gesture, every word, carried the invisible weight of exposure. They existed in a space reshaped by the consequences they had set in motion, a quiet recognition of their own missteps. I did not celebrate it, did not claim it as victory. It simply was. The truth had asserted itself, calmly and irrevocably. I returned to my routines, aligning the books, straightening the shelves, making coffee as I had for years. The rituals had lost none of their comfort, but they carried now a heavier awareness, a deeper understanding of the fragility of trust. Silence, observation, patience, they had preserved me even as the world of deception around me crumbled quietly. In the stillness, I realized the simplest truth. Life moves forward even after betrayal. There is no vindication, no applause, no satisfaction beyond clarity. The cost of seeing clearly is often carried in quiet, heavy moments, in measured breaths, in the simple act of continuing intact while the world shifts beneath you. I sat in the dim light, letting the silence settle over everything, aware of the distance now woven into the space between us. Nothing more needed to be said.